We're following the breaking news tonight. The Supreme Court has ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Maryland father Kilmer Armando Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. after mistakenly deporting him to a prison in El Salvador. A 9-0 ruling, by a 9-0 ruling, the court upheld an April 4th order from U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes. Joining me now is NBC News reporter Lawrence Hurley, MSNBC political analyst and former Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo of Florida. Hey, Lawrence, I want to key in on some interesting language right at the top in this order, which I know you've been digesting. The Chief Justice says the order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. I know a lot of folks are sort of fixating on facilitate. As a lawyer, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? What's your interpretation? What are you hearing this court saying to the administration at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because they're saying the district court was right to rule that the man had to be, that the government has to facilitate his return. But they said the judge was wrong to say that the government has to effectuate his return, saying that that might implicate some kind of foreign policy issues where, you know, the president normally has a lot of power and courts aren't supposed to interfere with that. So the issue here is what's the difference between facilitating and effectuating? And at this moment, having just looked at it, I can't really tell you the answer to that. But I think that's what the court below, when the case goes back, is going to be looking into, and the Trump administration as well is going to be probed on, you know, what are they going to do? And how are they going to facilitate his return so that he can get the due process that he should have had before he was deported? And so that's what's going to be playing out when it goes back to the district court now.
Yeah, you know, Carlos, there's a lot of interesting, thinking around this word facilitated, what it potentially means, particularly given from my reading of this in relation to what has come before. And it's even stated in this opinion, there's still this deference that the court has to this executive power, this executive authority that seemingly is all-knowing. The justice notes the district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. Well, this is not how you conduct a foreign affairs, by grabbing people off the street and shipping them to a foreign government prison camp.
Well, that's right, Michael. But I think the good news is that the court is following through from its previous order on the idea that people have due process rights. Right. And this individual was denied due process. Well, actually, they all were. Yeah. In this case, this person was improperly deported. And what the court is saying is that the government at least has to show some effort, show that it is trying to bring this individual back to the United States so that he can have the due process that the court guaranteed in the previous rule.
Lawrence, have you heard anything from the family? Have we heard anything yet from the family? Any response from their lawyers? I'm sure folks are pretty excited about this, but still this, what does facilitate mean? What is the process? But what are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard from them directly, but one thing that is worth bearing in mind is that the judge below, the district court judge, had set a deadline for the government to retrieve this man from El Salvador, and that deadline has passed. So, and the court basically put that on hold. So at the moment, he's still in prison, and he's going to be in prison probably for a while this case plays out, unless the Trump administration takes pretty aggressive steps to try and get him released, which they've shown no interest in doing so far. So there's definitely more litigation here to come. But as we've just heard, it's an important decision to say that, as it did in the other case about the people being deported to the Venezuelan gang members deported to El Salvador, that there are these due process rights that the government has to follow, and the court in both these cases has been pretty clear that there has to be some process here. You can't just throw people on planes and deport them in the middle of the night, without giving them any chance to contest what's going on.
I'm still not convinced that this administration believes that. I think there are going to be further tests ahead, Carlos, relative to this particular case. The speed with which they respond, the degree to which they do. I mean, do we get him back in a week? Do we get him back in a month? What does it say broadly on two fronts? One, how do you think the administration is going to look at it and receive what the court did tonight? And secondly, do you think this has any resonance with your former colleagues on the Hill who've been sitting back hoping the courts will act? Or maybe now they'll see the courts acting and say, oh, maybe we can do that too.
Yeah, well, look, I'll take the second question first. When it comes to immigration, I do not expect any pushback from Republicans against the administration. The economy, that's different because they think that could really affect them next fall. But on immigration, I think it's full deference from Republicans to the executive. And to be fair, politically, they still have the public on their side. We'll see how long that lasts, right? Because as these controversial cases come up, that could change. Now, in terms of what they will do, I think they will do the minimum that they need to do to comply with the order. This is not an administration that's going to admit they made a mistake, Michael. That I don't know that has ever happened.
No,
right?
That's true.
But I do think they don't want to defy a court order if they can avoid doing so, and they will probably just do the bare minimum to keep the courts out of their business.
Lawrence, the bare minimum on this case, are there others that potentially could wind up in front of the Supreme Court in short order? I know there's been a little bit back and forth at the appeals court level, the district court level on some of these questions. Do you see any movement, a general movement towards pushing these due process questions more directly to the court?
Yeah, I think as we saw the other day when the court basically said that the alleged Venezuelan gang members couldn't bring this case in D.C., where the court had said they had to be, get due process. But the court did say that they could file separate habeas corpus claims, which has now happened. And there's been cases filed in New York and in Texas on a class-wide basis, so that all these different people can push these claims that they must get due process before they can be deported. And those cases are now live. Judges have already ruled, issued temporary restraining orders, and based on how the Trump administration has acted on these other cases, you could imagine those being appealed and get more cases like that coming. And the Supreme Court, is probably going to have to weigh in a more substantive way on what exactly this due process looks like, and whether everyone has to file an independent claim or whether there can be these class-wide relief. And so these are the kind of issues that are going to be coming up, as well as other issues we don't even know about yet, I'm sure.
Right. The thing that makes me scratch my head, Carlos, and how did Republicans get on the wrong side of due process? I mean, I don't understand. I mean, when you served in Congress, did you see any inkling that this would be the spot that they would land on with respect to the rights of individuals in this country, a party that was founded on those individual rights and liberties, right? Going back to breaking from the Whigs over issues like slavery because of how we treat people and the rights that they did not have recognized. And here they are. I don't understand that piece of it.
Well, it's not consistent with the whole pro-life idea, right, that we respect and value the dignity of every human life. We have seen how immigrants have become dehumanized in this immigration debate in this country. And look, were there excesses in the previous administration? Sure, there's plenty to criticize. But the idea, we don't know this person who got deported. I can't vouch for him. I don't know if he's a good guy or not. But the idea that there wouldn't be a process in place to guarantee some minimum rights and just to make sure that we're not making a mistake, that we're not sending someone who's innocent, someone who doesn't deserve it, someone who the law may protect in other ways to a third country. I mean, this is not like they're in the Chrome Detention Center down in Homestead, where I'm from, and we could just go and let the person out. Now this person is gone. So yes, I mean, there is a lack of appreciation for placing the individual and individual rights, over government coercive,
Right.
heavy-handed government action.
Right, exactly. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson wrote a statement respecting the court's decision, but criticized the Trump administration's arguments, writing, quote, "The government argument, moreover, implies that it could deport and incarcerate any person, including U.S. citizens, without legal consequences, so long as it does so before a court can intervene." That's going a little bit to what you were just saying, Carlos, about respecting this process and this administration apparently sometimes obliterating those lines with respect to process and other times trying to get right up on top of them. And the court, both in its majority, but also in the dissent a little bit, says, hey, both of those things we need to be very much aware of, that, yeah, administratively we want to support and respect the executive, but they can't go but so far. And I think that's going to be an interesting test, Lawrence, going forward, in how this court is going to look at these cases that I was just referring to coming before them down the pike.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting what Justice Sotomayor said, because she's basically saying the court should never have got involved in this case at all, because what happened was Chief Justice John Roberts issued an administrative stay the other day that basically meant that the judge's deadline for Abrigo Garcia to be retrieved didn't happen. And so she was making the point that, like, this is something we didn't need to get involved in this at all. The judge below had already ruled that Abrigo Garcia needs to get due process rights, and that's what we're saying in this decision. So they weren't dissenting, they were just kind of agreeing with what the court did today, but they were disagreeing with the Chief Justice's decision to issue that stay a couple of days ago, because if he hadn't done that, this case might be over now.
This is so true. Lawrence Hurley, thank you so much for coming on as quickly as you did. Carlos Cabello, it was another bad day for the markets amid worsening trade tensions with China, wiping out much of yesterday's gain after the president announced the 90-day pause on tariffs. At a cabinet meeting this afternoon, the president said he was not tracking a fall in the stock market, even as the market declined all around him, with the S&P 500 down more than 3%. Stocks tumbled after the White House clarified that its tariff on all Chinese goods is at least 145%, even higher than previously believed. On Wednesday, Trump pulled back on a series of harsh tariffs, escalating his trade war with China, but lowering many of the tariffs he had just imposed on the rest of the world. As NBC put it, Liberation Day just gave way to Capitulation Day. Or as the Wall Street Journal put it, he blinked. Trump indeed is the only one who blinked, while China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union did not. Trump is creating an illusion, folks, that he holds all the cards. But the truth is, that's increasingly clear. He does not hold that much, if anything at all. But according to the White House, there's really nothing to see here.
Up 2, down 1 is not a bad ratio, or up 10, down 5. And I think, as we have talked about, as we go through the queue and settle with these countries who are going to bring us their best offers, we will end up in a place of great certainty over the next 90 days on tariffs. We had very good inflation numbers today. Oil's down. We had a successful bond market, so I don't see anything unusual today.
I don't know what his definition of unusual is, but okay. Joining me now is CNBC senior analyst Ron Insana, and back with me is MSNBC political analyst and former Republican Congressman Carlos Cabello of Florida. So here's the deal. The House budget framework that we saw passed today extends the 2017 tax cuts. So that's $3.8 trillion. Additional tax cuts of $1.5 trillion. Increased spending of $521 billion for border, defense, immigration. Spending cuts, mutual agreement, $1.5 trillion. Total cost, $6.9 trillion over 10 years, and $38 trillion more from 2035 to 2055. I don't understand what the number, how the math works there, Mr. Insana. Tell me, please, what we got.
I wish I could. I mean, assuming that we're going to cut $1.5 trillion from the federal budget over any period of time. And I don't know if that's a 10-year figure or an immediate figure, but in order to cut $1.5 trillion from the federal budget in the short run, you would be attacking either entitlements, defense spending, or interest on the federal debt, which now tops $1 trillion. So I don't know how you get to those numbers. In any case, even if they cut federal spending, the deficit and the national debt will increase over time. And there are a variety of other proposals that are looped in there for which there is no math. There's one game that's being played in Congress right now where they're essentially saying that the tax cut extensions, because they don't change the baseline assumptions on spending going forward, means that the tax cuts cost nothing or will add nothing to the deficit and debt over time. It's the parliamentarian would have to rule on that, but it's a pretty slick trick to try when we know, in fact, deficits and debt will go up with this particular package of proposals.
Well, that's exactly it. The math still maths, no matter what you say. I mean, Carlos, come on, help me out here. Look, let's just do a comparison, right? Let's go just take a quick snapshot of how stocks have performed since January through this week. There it is. In January, around the 7th of the month, look at where the stocks were. The NASDAQ, right? All of these stocks were Dow Jones today down 7, SPY down 10, NASDAQ down 15%. So the math is the math. And to Ron's point, no matter what you say or how you dress it up, you still got to pay for all of this.
Well, Michael, and the beauty and the painful thing about markets is that they don't lie.
They don't.
They react and they look forward. They react and they predict based on facts, based on evidence. And I know this is a political show, but I think viewers are going to have to start becoming comfortable with this concept of bond yields and what they mean. Okay, because bond yields
Ron just tuned into the conversation when you said
and he can explain it.
God bless any politician who acknowledges the bond market's role in the economy and the importance of the signal sending message that comes from interest rates. And the fact that they are going up in an environment when we're facing the possibility of a downturn in the economy tells us a lot about what investors think of these various programs that are being put into place.
Well, and at the end of the day, it's all about trust.
Right.
The less people trust our country, the more we have to pay them to hold our debt. And that is what's happening right now. There's so much uncertainty. You add to it all those trillions that you talk about, when we dump all of that on top of this tariff uncertainty and all of this just unreliability, I think we're going to see bond yields continue to go up. And that makes us all poorer. Every single American, because it's going to cost so much to carry our debt. And it's going to be harder and harder to borrow to continue funding our government.
Absolutely.
So we got, I think, a pretty long and difficult road ahead.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, not only that increase in interest rates puts downward pressure on the stock market. And as the congressman is indicating, the loss of trust, if indeed that's what's taking place in the U.S. Treasury market, and we see this in the price of gold, which is hitting a new all-time high above $3,200 an ounce tonight as we speak, means that safe haven asset that we call U.S. Treasuries may be dissipating, and we could see a buyer's boycott. Global investors could look elsewhere to place their money. And so with no end game in sight in this trade war, first with China and then to a degree with the rest of the world, and we now have the highest tariffs, the other day notwithstanding, in the entire world. This is going to make things very, very difficult going forward until there is, or unless there is, some definitive resolution to this process. And from what you were talking about, Michael, at the top of the show, with respect to the chaotic, speedy, and somewhat, let's say, potentially, in the case of immigration and deportation, illegal activities being undertaken by the administration, they're following a very similar script with respect to the economy, and it's creating all kinds of chaos. If Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent were still a hedge fund manager as he was prior to taking the job, this type of volatility in the markets would not be considered in his mind normal. And he might be getting a margin call and having to take some rather large steps to, kind of balance his positions in the financial markets.
Well, and that raises a lot of questions about why individuals like Mr. Besant and others who are out of this space, Carlos, who understand markets, maybe not to the same extent as you do with respect to bond yields.
I'm sure he knows a lot more than I do.
He does. I'm having a little fun there. But the reality of it is, what is it that people who know better with highfalutin degrees, and highfalutin is a specific term here, being so dumb and not actually properly advising? Maybe they are advising and the president isn't listening. But when you shed $6 trillion from the economy, someone's got to be paying attention.
Michael, I think Besant and others are doing their best. And look, this is a very dramatic version of what happened during Trump 1.0. I was on the Ways and Means Committee. I remember the big talk back then was NAFTA.
Right.
The president wanted to withdraw from NAFTA. Peter Navarro wanted the president to withdraw from NAFTA. And Sonny Perdue, who was the ag secretary at the time, other advisors of the president went to him and said, this is not a good idea. We should not just cancel NAFTA. It would be terrible for American farmers, and it would just be horrible for our economy. It would be a shock to our economy. Right. And that time, the president listened. We renegotiated NAFTA. It's now the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement. He wanted to get rid of the name. We said, okay, that's fine. Let's get rid of the name.
He just threw that in the trash, right?
But let's keep this deal, which we've negotiated, because it's good for us and it's good for our neighbors and it's good for our economy. That doesn't seem to be happening as often in Trump 2.0 as it happened in Trump 1.0, where he actually listened to some of the smarter people around him giving him good advice. Up until a day ago or two, it seemed like Peter Navarro was fully in charge of America's trade policy.
There you go. Ron Insana, thank you, man. I have one more for you, which I got to get you back on to talk about, and that's the whole thing that went down with the SPY options and what that
and the NASDAQ options as well. They bought them right before the announcement.
Yeah, what that smelled like. So
we know what it smells like. The question is, and the congressman can answer this in the future, it's not really illegal for elected officials to trade inside information because no one will prosecute it.
Yeah, we got to work on that law.
I didn't make money trading stocks. I must have done something wrong.
Ron and Senator, thank you.
Right.
Carlos is sticking around. He's my anchor buddy for tonight. President Trump's erratic tariff war has wiped away billions of dollars from Americans' retirement accounts, which explains why a majority of Americans are worried about their personal finances, unemployment, and inflation. Ignoring those concerns, congressional Republicans are moving full steam ahead with Trump's plan to slash taxes for the rich at the expense of average Americans. This morning, House Republicans did their part and passed a budget framework. Senate and House Republicans will now get together and figure out how they will cut federal programs to pay for a $3.8 trillion tax cut for the very wealthy in our nation, and a $520 billion boost in spending for immigration, energy, and defense. Former Congressman Carlos Curbelo is back with me still, and joining us is Faz Shakur, Executive Director of the nonprofit A More Perfect Union. Welcome to the table. So let's just revisit the number here so we can know what we're talking about, because the math, as I said before, it's still maths. You're looking at the House budget framework. Extension of the 2017 tax cuts will increase our debt. We have to spend $3.8 trillion. Additional tax cut are an additional $1.5 trillion. Increased spending, $521 for border defense immigration. Spending cuts, mutual agreement on reducing that $1.5 trillion. The cost is a total of $6.9 trillion over 10 years, gentlemen, and $38 trillion more between 2035 and 55. Faz, I mean, I don't know where the number comes from. I mean, how do you look the country in the eye and say we're going to spend this much more money. We're, oh, by the way, increasing the national debt ceiling by $5 trillion. So you know they're going to spend, they're going to spend that.
Just for some perspective, we created, I'm sandwiched here, I will disclose, I was original co-sponsor of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We created $1.5 trillion in deficit spending. I thought back then, this is too much. We should do this deficit neutral. The number now is
crazy.
And the tax cuts are spending, right? There's a form of government telling people this is what we choose as our priorities. These tax cuts, if you look at this tax package, if you're in the top 0.1%, that's households of $3.5 million a year. So if you're in that household, you're going to get about a tax cut of $300,000. And you take that amount of money, how much they're going to get, about $300,000 per that small group, and you look at the bottom 60%. That's a group of, let's say, around 95,000 and under, Michael. That's 187 million Americans. About $400. You get $400. So, yeah, they're going to sprinkle you a little penny.
Yeah.
And they're going to take it and give it to the wealthy. And what are they going to do in turn? Cut Medicaid in order to pay for it all.
Well, and I think, Michael, that's what's troubling. And look, I think there's a lot in the 2017 bill that both parties would pass in a bipartisan manner, especially the individual rate cuts, the doubling of the child tax credit, the doubling of the standard deduction. But how are you going to pay for it? And when you have $880 billion assigned to a committee that, if they're going to cut energy and commerce in the House, it means they're going to cut Medicaid. Right. How are they going to get around that? The president's saying no cuts to Medicaid. Well, I don't know if you can meet the number unless you make cuts to Medicaid. And if you can't meet the number, you know this, the whole bill falls apart because that's part of the reconciliation process. It's technical, but you have to follow the instructions that are in the resolution.
In addition to the math that you're pointing out in Medicaid, which is correct, I got myself worked up listening to Speaker Johnson, who said, you know, we got young men who are sitting and playing video games, and we gotta cut their Medicaid. And I'm like, do you know, in his own district, there's 38% of people with Medicaid. Yeah. We're going out to David Valadio's district, that's in Central Valley in California, 67+% of people with Medicaid. Do you know? They're working at Tesla, they're working at Walmart, they're working at McDonald's, they're working at Dollar General. They're working to try to get by. They're on Medicaid. But here comes, so the math is correct. You can't pay for this. And you're taking it away from people who are desperately just trying to get by. And it's an obscenity. It's a moral obscenity that you would give tax cuts to the rich while taking it away from people. And young men are not, you know, they're not like, oh, I want to go to the doctor. Like, I just want to get Medicaid. That'd be awesome. I just want to sit here and tool around and play video games and get Medicaid. That's not the way human behavior works.
Well, and you know, to be blunt about it, I'm just so done with the bull, you know, stereotyping, you know, of individuals, whether it's, you know, a mom, you know, taking advantage of the system, or a young man sitting there just playing video games, collecting a check, or the insane thinking that, you know, people, they wake up in the morning and all they want to be today is poor and leech off the system. I've not run into that American, and I've been on this planet a little while, and I've been around this country, as you know, as you have as well. What is it about that aspect of all of this that we just can't be honest and call the thing what it is? That we would much rather feather the cap of the wealthiest individuals who have that wealth already, and you're just making them richer, as opposed to doing what the party says it's trying to do or wants to be, a party of the working man and woman. You talked, Faz, about the $400 and that 2017 tax cut. I know folks in Prince George's County, Maryland, who saw $50 a week increase in their pay period in their paycheck. $50. So, I mean, what is it about this fixation? If we want to get a working community working again, instead of demonizing them, give them the tax cut.
It's
maybe don't need Social Security if you give them a tax cut.
We're living at a time where this new Republican Party is appealing to working classes on cultural issues, but economically it is still more supply side, more geared toward tax cuts for everyone, including the wealthy. And then you have the Democratic Party, which culturally I think is appealing to wealthier people, right? College-educated people. We're seeing the numbers. Democrats are gaining college-educated voters, but they still have an economic message that is for the working classes. So, you know, these wires seem to be crossed here, and I don't know if you have any ideas as to how this will all get sorted out.
You'll get the last word on this.
If you look at Trump's policies, they don't know what problem they're trying to solve. Right now, the problem is not that wealthy people are struggling in this economy, that businesses can't create capital. Those are doing fine. I mean, that's what he inherited from President Biden. Economy that was working quite well, but what we needed to do was people who are struggling to deal with housing, struggling to deal with childcare, finding it that, you know, as elderly parents age, trying to take care of them. Those are the kinds of things that are more dealing with middle-class pocketbooks than ever before. Just owning a car and owning a house. And that, to my mind, is what you got to solve for. How are you going to put people in a position to get by on their daily lives? And I would hope if we can focus on that, we can deliver policies. And to your point, Michael, we could talk about tax cuts, we could talk about incentives, better jobs, better wages, but it ain't going to be tax cuts for the rich and cutting Medicaid.
Amen. Former Congressman Carlos Cabello, who's been hanging with me since the top of the hour. And I appreciate that.
Anytime you feel lonely.
You got it, my friend. And Faz Shakir, thank you. Thing that's been going on over the past few months, I'm sure a lot of you at home are sitting there thinking, how the hell did we get here? Well, the answer to that question, you know, is somewhere back there. We're going to have to go back to 2024 and the election that was like nothing we've ever seen. The American people were witness to most of it. The disastrous debate, the assassination attempt, President Biden dropping out, and Vice President Harris's historic run over 107 days. But there was also a lot that happened behind the scenes that we didn't know that much about until now. The new book, Fight, takes us inside both campaigns to unpack how Trump staged a comeback and ultimately what actually went wrong for the Democrats. Joining me now is Jonathan Allen, senior national political reporter for NBC News, and Amy Parnes, senior correspondent for The Hill. They are co-authors of Fight, Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, debuting at #1 on the New York Times bestseller this week. Folks, welcome. Congratulations to you both. That's incredibly good news, I'm sure, for both of you. You know, the interesting thing for me, Amy, is that on the surface, it appered that, you know, Harris had all the momentum. Yeah. You know, the energy was there, 300,000 people on a phone call. Hey, we're down with Harris. $1 billion raised in a week. But beneath that, you had a lot of folks who did not want her to be the nominee. You guys unpack that in this book.
Yeah, we do. And I think, you know, even going into election night, I think she saw and she thought that she was going to win. So did Tim Walz. They saw the crowds. They felt the vibe. They knew that they had raised a lot of money in fundraising. They had more boots on the ground, and their grassroots efforts were stronger than President Trump's. And so I think they thought that they had it made. But in reality, I think it was a lot different. And so what we did in this book was sort of we take you behind the scenes to look at what really happened and why they were sort of misled into thinking that they were going to win.
You know, Jonathan, I go right to the point that Amy raised. You have this quote from the book regarding the efforts of the Biden's team, you know, trying to hold on to the nomination and sort of do the Heisman with his vice president, noting one donor on the receiving end of an electronic message summed up the sentiments of Biden's top aides. They were aggressively saying that we would wind up with the vice president, and that would be a mistake. Did Harris see any of this coming? Was there any inkling in her camp?
I mean, I don't think so. Obviously, they talk to some of the same people, so they probably have some idea of what's going on. But, I mean, you just go into this moment here where Joe Biden and his campaign are trying to save him by drowning Kamala Harris, right, even though she is the obvious choice to take over for him.
Is the sitting vice president.
Sitting vice president. It is inconceivable to me, and I think to most people who know how the Democratic Party rules work, that they would have ended up with anybody other than her. And that's actually what the Biden folks are seizing onto in that moment. They're like, we can keep him in if we could just prove to everybody else that she stinks, even though they know if there's a change, they're then going to have to try to resurrect her. It's just, you know, the attention on Joe Biden's self-interest, right, in those 24 days is just so revealing and so crushing to the Democratic Party. But it's not just about those details, and we have a ton of them in the book, and I hope people will read it, and I think it's a fascinating story. But for Democrats to figure out how they're going to get out of this wilderness, they're going to have to look at all of the sort of agendas, all of the self-interest that's going on, where they weren't all pointed at the one thing, which was stopping Donald Trump, where some of the people had different agendas. And then voters, Democratic grassroots activists are going to have to demand from their leaders that the leaders are honest with them about things like whether or not the candidate is in shape to continue, and to be more straightforward with them. And that's, to me, one of the big lessons of this book. And if you read it, you'll come out thinking, like Amy and I do, that the path for the Democrats in the future is for the average voter to hold accountable that consultant class, the operative class, and the political leaders that I think not only deceived Democratic voters, but to Amy's point, even deceived Kamala Harris to the point on election night she was shocked that she lost. It did not compute. She goes to sleep that night thinking, what the hell happened? You opened with what the hell happened, and she thought, what the hell happened? But she too had been gaslit by the leadership of the party.
Amy, the interesting part, and there are a lot of interesting parts that you guys get into. There's this juxtaposition of two very obvious aspects of this of the Kamala Harris campaign: her race and her gender, and the role that played in this evolving story, and how even in the face of those things, folks were still saying, well, we got Gavin Newsom. It's like, but what about the sister in the corner?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty astounding when you think about it, Michael, because there were people who really didn't think that she could win from the outset. They were saying, let's consider other options. Let's consider an open primary, even though that probably didn't make the most sense because of fundraising and everything else, and because she was already on the ticket and campaigning. But yeah, there was definitely an effort to try to look at other alternatives, and that's what we reveal in the book for the first time, that people like Barack Obama might have been trying to float this bigger idea of an open primary. And that was really upsetting to a lot of people in her camp.
Michael, even the day that Biden passes the baton to Kamala Harris, she gets on the phone with Barack Obama.
This is a great scene.
She has had to push Biden to give an endorsement that same day, which we report for the first time. 2 phone calls, and she's like urging Biden to endorse her, and he's like, maybe I'll do it in a few days. And she's like, no, there's going to be a whip operation to try to nail down the nomination. I need your endorsement now. So she gets that taken care of, takes a couple calls, gets that taken care of, and then she's on the phone with Barack Obama, and he says, when she's asking everybody for their endorsement, and he says, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale. And he is organizing phone calls with other Democrats, including Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, who thinks to himself, I got to get my endorsement of Harris out before I get on the phone with Obama, because Obama's going to try to rope me into this open convention. And so Clyburn puts out his endorsement, then gets on the phone with Obama, and basically, to your point, says, we're getting behind Kamala Harris. I'm behind Kamala Harris. There's none of this crazy stuff going on. That phone call that Obama was hoping to, at least Clyburn thought Obama was going to try to cajole him into this open primary. Clyburn basically shuts it down within a minute.
Hey, Amy, it's just so fascinating that, Kamala's an accomplished individual. She is the vice president. She pretty much got thrown in at the deep end of the pool on a number of things. They said, oh, go ahead and solve the problem at the border, and while you're at it, handle black issues. And, oh, could you go overseas, by the way, and talk to the Europeans? And yet and still, you just have this thing that's sort of persisted throughout. Why, if that was the case, why didn't the Democrats, after the State of the Union of 2023, the president's on a high horse, just managed to negotiate in front of the country with Republicans and put them back on their heels? Great moment to go to him and say, do you want to be a transitional president? You have just transitioned to retirement. So because there is no room for you in the next election, step down.
Yeah, and I think, I don't think anyone really tried to do that because they all felt like he had a successful first term, and they pointed to big moments like the State of the Union, and they said, look, he performed really well here. He's going to perform really well in the debate. I mean, that was one of the things that caused them to do the debate. They thought, okay, he does well in these big moments. And so no one wanted to really force him out. And at the same time, he was digging his heels in and kind of undermining, the people were undermining Kamala Harris at the same time. I mean, when you look at those 24 days, we have this really strong anecdote of people, trying to undermining her and saying, if you force him out of the race, you're going to be stuck with Kamala Harris, which is pretty astounding when you think about it.
No, you weren't stuck with Kamala Harris. You're going to be stuck with Donald Trump. And that's the part that the Democrats never figured out. A lot of Republicans who crossed the aisle to support Kamala Harris, when they started with Joe Biden, figured it out. A lot of independent voters who were, with Nikki Haley, transitioned to Kamala Harris, figured out. The Democrats didn't. This book right here, folks, let's take a look. Right here spells it all out. It's #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Jonathan Allen, Amy Parnes, thank you both. We'll be right back.